U.S. v. Nixon by Jenny, Sydney, Michael, and Ian. Outline of the case. The question was, is the President's right to safeguard certain information using its executive privilege, confidentiality power entirely immune from judicial review? The answer was ultimately no, with the ruling that there was limited executive privilege and that it could not be used freely and must be used within correct parameters. Although it really outlawed the use of it in criminal investigations and that Nixon must pass over the tapes. This was a unanimous decision by the Burger Court, with Rehnquist withholding his vote. The small details of the case. This case was ultimately decided in the Supreme Court. The case was tried July 8th in 1974 and decided July 24th, 1974. The opinion was given by Warren E. Burger. Background. This case included 37th President Richard Nixon in the United States. The case revolved around the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's attempt at covering it up and other wrongdoings. Richard Nixon. Nixon was born January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. He died April 22, 1994. Nixon attended law school at Duke University. Nixon had a military background and ran for and had many political positions and government positions. He held positions like congressman, senator, vice president, and president. While his presidency is controversial, he did establish the EPA, abolish voter discrimination tests, signed Title IX, signed the Paris Peace Accords, etc.
Watergate. The events of Watergate began in 1972. 5 burglars were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex on June 17, 1972. Nixon was tied to the criminals through his re-election campaign and took aggressive steps to cover up everything that had happened and his involvement, using executive privilege, which leads into the case of the U.S. vs. Nixon. The meaning of executive privilege. This is the privilege of the President and other high executive officials to not disclose certain communications if it would disrupt the functions and decision-making process of the executive branch. Executive privilege has been a continuous argument since George Washington was president. The beginning. The Watergate scandal was starting to be investigated more thoroughly after it was revealed that President Nixon was involved with the scandal even though he denied so. This caused Nixon to conspire to obstruct the FBI's investigation of Watergate. The revelations. During the trials and the investigation, it was revealed that Nixon had taped the conversations within the Oval Office. This information came from Alexander Butterfield, who could not lie when asked a direct question about the possibility of tapes during a pre-interview.
The struggle over the tapes. Prosecutors knew that if they could get a hold of the tapes, then they could easily prove Nixon guilty. Through the summer and fall of 1973, Nixon struggled to keep a hold on the tapes and argued he had executive privilege. An independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox refused to stop demanding the tapes, which led Nixon to demand he be fired. The Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon's demands that Cox be fired led to the Saturday Night Massacre. This event took place October 20th, 1973, and it is when multiple Justice Department officials resigned to protest Nixon's demands. Finally, Nixon decided to part ways with some, but not all, of his tapes. The Unraveling. In 1974, Nixon's attempts to hide from the consequences of his actions began to fall apart. March 1, 1974, 7 aides to Nixon were indicted by grand jury, appointed by a new special prosecutor in events related to Watergate. The jury called Nixon an unindicted co-conspirator because they were not sure if they could indict a sitting president. Nixon's downfall. When July rolled around, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to pass over his tapes. Nixon tried to draw it out as long as he could, but the House of Representatives had started voting to impeach Nixon for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and several violations of the Constitution.
The end for Nixon. Nixon released the tapes that implicated him guilty on August 5, 1974, and resigned August 8 because of his impending impeachment. He fled the office August 9 in disgrace. 6 weeks later, when Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president, he pardoned Nixon of his crimes. Nixon never officially confessed to having committed the crimes he would have been found guilty of if not pardoned. Lasting effects on the American people. Nixon's abuse of presidential power left a lasting distrusting and cynical air to the American people when they think of the national political climate and U.S. government. A look into executive privilege in this case. Nixon tried to use executive privilege to avoid being found guilty of an involvement in the Watergate scandal. Nixon was trying to keep tapes of his conversations in the Oval Office from the court. Prior to this case, it was unclear if presidents had this power as it is not listed in the Constitution. This case clarified that while they had this power, it was not absolute. Because of this case, executive privilege is now limited in the sense that it is not applicable if being used to avoid criminal investigation. This is a visual timeline of Watergate.